think we have to think very, very seriously in countries like Britain and America. What are we going to do about the fact that we have so many people in our midst who do know what happened on the 7th of October and do support it and would like it more? They have adopted the lexicon and the dress even of the Islamic extremists. It would be as if in the wake of 9/11 there'd been a huge movement of people deciding to grow beards to look like Osama bin Laden.
You look at something like Queers for Palestine, for example. I mean, how suicidal do you think these alliances are?
All the wrong people meet at the point of hell, don't they?
You famously had a clash on Joe Rogan with Dave Smith.
I was interested watching Piers Morgan talking to the international lawyer, a friend of mine, Natasha Hausdorff, and being exceptionally rude. And he turns to comic Dave Smith and he says, you know, these Israelis, so they're treating us like that we're just clowns, you know, sort of thing. You get, your other guest is literally a clown. That's his job.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Douglas Murray. Douglas, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be with you.
I've wanted you on for a long time, so it's really good to have you on. We got the perfect excuse now because you have this excellent new book out called On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel, Hamas, and the Future of the West. It's a book that touches on topics close to your heart, of course, close to mine. I know many listeners to this podcast will already have read it, and if they haven't, they definitely should. So there's a lot I want to ask you about this book. So the 7th of October pogrom happens. It's barbarous beyond belief. The West fails to offer the righteous opposition to it that it should have. That's the kind of tale that you tell in this book. Was there a moment after 7th of October? Was there an incident, or when was it after that event that you thought to yourself, okay, the world is going to go mad over this. This is not going to play out in the way that it would in a more civilized era?
Yes, there was. There's a very specific moment, which I describe in the book, as you know, which is that on the 8th of October, I was in New York at the time, and on the 8th of October, I heard there was a demonstration that had been arranged the previous day, and it was taking place in Times Square in the center of New York, tourist venue, place where normally, you know, kids get photographs with people dressed as Spider-Man and things like that. And I went down to Times Square to see what this protest was about. And it was a pro-Hamas, the slaughter protest. It was, I mean, the massacre was still going on in the south of Israel. And here were hundreds of people in New York. Some of them, you know, hijabi women and, you know, Muslim men, obviously on the side of Hamas and, you know, waving placards celebrating what was going on. And some, you know, American people waving placards saying that, you know, non-Muslim looking Americans who were waving placards saying, by any means necessary, and things like that. And I just thought, what is happening? You know, I mean, you can be, as you know, I mean, if somebody can favor the creation of another Palestinian state and, you know, all sorts of things like that. But why would you choose the moment when Hamas's massacre is still going on to support the people doing the massacre and to attack the people who've been attacked? And that was when I thought, oh, this is going to go wildly wrong. Because, I mean, that was before Israel had done anything in response to the massacre. So I thought, well, you know, gear up. This is going to go crazy. And that was when I thought several things. One was to get there as soon as possible to Israel. And that was partly because I realized as well, we're going to live in an era of denial. And, you know, something that those of us who've covered related subjects know very well, which is, you know, you get this combination of it didn't happen. It would be good if it did happen. And all at the same time, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it didn't happen, but if it did happen, it was fine and justifiable. Exactly. You know, had those two opinions at the same time. Yeah, I had a similar response to the event in London, which you also write about in your book, which was that on the 9th of October, you rightly call it a celebration outside the Israeli embassy in London. People were dancing, playing pop music, letting off fireworks. They were in a very, very good mood because more than 1,000 Jews had just been butchered by Hamas. It was an extraordinary sight. So when you saw the event in New York and then the events in London and elsewhere in the world as well, outside the Sydney Opera House, of course, where people gathered to say, fuck the Jews, while Jews were still dying. Just extraordinary events in the civilized capitals of the West. What was your initial thought on all that stuff? What did you think? You've obviously spelt out in the book in great detail what you think this tells us about the West. But when you first saw all that, did you think the West is in more trouble than even you thought beforehand?
Yes, I did. I think there's quite a lot of things that have gone on, which I describe in the book, but I realized that several things. One is that there is something about the Israelis in the minds of some of the general public in the rest of the West that makes them uniquely undeserving of sympathy, empathy, or anything related to that. So that, for instance, survivors of the Nova Party, young people who are dancing in the early hours of the morning and who are set upon by Hamas terrorists, massacred, raped, and much more. So survivors of the Nova Party have been treated, and I give examples in the book of the treatment at Manchester Airport and indeed in New York City. They are treated where they go as if they themselves are culprits of some kind. They themselves are suspects. That's totally different from the way in which, if Britain remembered things like the Manchester Arena bombing of 2017, we would be horrified, amazed if, say, two young women who had survived that suicide bombing at the Ariana Grande concert traveled elsewhere in the world and were treated as if they'd done it. You know, nobody would tolerate that. So what are you talking about? These are the victims of the attack. They are not the attackers. But many things maybe, have settled into the general public mind, not the whole public, but a lot of the public, that make the Israelis uniquely undeserving of just human sympathy and empathy, understanding. And the second thing is, of course, or another of the many things is, I think that we have seen, as I describe in the book, we have seen a form of projection, psychological projection on a vast scale. So that the Israelis are accused of things which they haven't done or aren't doing by people who either want to do those things themselves, or would like the Israelis to suffer those things, or who have been told that these are things that they themselves have done. And I give the example because I just think psychological projection is an extraordinary thing. I'm completely persuaded by the theories of the scapegoat and much more. But they have acted, the Israelis have been used in the year and a half or so since 7th of October as a giant projection mechanism by people like the young people who don't have any dog in the fight, who from Britain to Australia to Canada to America, accuse the Israelis of specific things, of colonialism, of genocide, of white supremacy, of racism, and all of these things. And of course, as I point out in the book, these are all things that these young people in particular have been told that they themselves are guilty of. So that if you're born in America in the late 20th, early 21st century, you're guilty of colonialism. You're guilty of living on stolen land and much more. And as I wrote in my last book, in The War on the West, it was unclear to me what you do as a generation or as a person if you've been told that you're guilty of crimes for which you have no responsibility. What are you to do? This is an unalleviatable situation. And the answer turns out to have presented itself in the form of of the one Jewish state, which is you accuse that state of the things you were told you're guilty of.
Yeah.
And this is psychological projection on a grand and very dangerous scale.
Yeah, it's so well put in the book, where I really agree with that. It's like Israel has become the sin bearer for these people in the West, and they kind of push the sins onto Israel and then demonize it for that reason. It's almost like a religious spectacle rather than a kind of political movement. I want to talk to you a little bit about 7th of October itself. And the first chapter in your book is called What Happened? And it lays out in incredible detail some of the events that took place on that day. And there are points in there that just leap out at me. I mean, they sound so obvious now, but it's also incredibly refreshing to hear someone actually say them. So, for example, the vulnerability of the kids at the Nova Festival, you described that. You know, these are kids who will have had a few drinks, maybe taken some illicit substances. They were dancing. It's very early in the morning. That's an incredibly vulnerable position to be in when there's a kind of army of fascists coming right over the border through on the land and the air to come and get you. I mean, all the most despicable events. How do you understand the day itself? Because I've struggled to find the words to describe it. I don't think terrorism works. It seems to be something worse than that. Even massacre doesn't seem to do justice to what happened. How do you see it historically? What do you think it represented?
Well, it represented the desire of Hamas's leadership and members and a wider population, it has to be said, because the army of 4,000 to 6,000 people who came over was in waves. It was dedicated Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists, and then waves of others, and then eventually waves of Gazan civilians who came to join in the fun. And looted and scouted and stole, and sometimes just joined in. But it was an almost orgiastic eruption of the hatred that Hamas had inculcated for years. And I say at one point in the book that I think that although Israel was obviously caught sleeping to a great extent, and there were huge errors, mistakes, oversights, and failures of system after system within Israel that this could have happened. But people fail, institutions fail, get caught literally napping. Nevertheless, the thing that most people find hard to recognize in the mind of people who, like those who organized and perpetrated that attack, is that these people really do mean what they say. And we in the West broadly are very bad at realizing that and taking them at their words, so that it seems obviously crazy when Yahya Sinwar, after being released from an Israeli jail for killing Palestinians with his own hands, goes on to retake control of Hamas in Gaza, plans and leads the October the 7th massacre. It seems crazy that a few years before, he stands in Gaza and says, we're going to go into Israel, we're going to rip the hearts out of the Jews. It sounds to the Western mind, I think, to a great extent, as if, well, that's some kind of metaphorical, maybe people will have maybe what he really wants is a two-state solution, and this is just a poetic way of saying that, or something like that. It seems to be very hard for people to realize, no, that's literally what he wants to do, and what he got people to do on the 7th. And, as I say, I think the world, if it had watched, got a glimpse into the fanatic mindset, which we could do with studying, because there are clearly so many people in our own countries who want to emulate this and are hot for this. And, how is it that in Britain we have hundreds of thousands, at least, of people who are sympathetic to Hamas, support Hamas, and much more? What are we going to do about that? maybe we just hope it's okay. And, maybe we condemn the Israeli government for protecting its people and hope we buy ourselves some time. But I don't think that's, remotely up to the moment. I think we have to think very, very seriously in countries like Britain and America. What are we going to do about the fact that we have so many people in our midst who do know what happened on the 7th of October and do support it and would like it more?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that is the $1 million question. And I want to ask you about those Hamasniks across the Western world, of which there are many. But I just want to ask you one more question about Israel itself, because you have this great line early in the book where you talk about the seeming invincibility of Israel. I mean, Israel is widely seen, even by the people who hate it, and there are many people who hate it. It's seen as a strong nation. It's seen as a plucky nation. It's seen as a nation that doesn't take any crap. And it has to be like that because it's surrounded by nations and armies that wish to destroy it. So you've been to Israel. You write about it in the book. You've traveled there widely. You've been to Gaza as well. I think you're one of the only journalists who's been to Gaza. What impact did 7th of October have on Israel? I mean, how devastating was it to the psyche, I guess? And is part of the reason that they're fighting back so fiercely against Hamas in Gaza now, because they realize this was a devastating blow to the security and sanctity of the world's only Jewish nation? How big a blow was that to Israel?
Oh, it was huge. The deal of Zionism, in a way, is the world will not protect the Jews. This is the crucial insight of Theodor Herzl in the 1890s. The world will not protect the Jews. The Jews are the only people who can protect the Jews. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I agree with Herzl. I think it absolutely is the case. And it's been shown again gloriously in the last 18 months.
Yeah.
I think that insight is correct. And therefore, the fact that this could happen in the one country where Jews rely on the fact that they are being protected was psychologically devastating.
Yeah.
And it was a huge blow, and it's one that the trauma of which is still going on. And that trauma will not even begin to be over until, among other things, remaining hostages Hamas are holding are returned to their families. Hamas, like a lot of Islamic extremist groups, they know very well how to attack the soft underbelly. And there's a reflection I make in the book, which actually I've been thinking about since and taken sort of a step further, which is, I mentioned at one point that the great Prussian general and strategist Clausewitz famously says in On War that the way to attack an enemy is you have to hit it at its center of gravity. And that of course was the rule for Napoleonic era armies. You went straight at the body of the opposing force. But in very interesting ways, Hamas, like other jihadist groups, do a different tactic, which is they hit your weakest and most vulnerable points. A pop concert in Manchester. Yeah. A football game in Paris, or a rock concert in Paris, a dance party in the south of Israel. And this is a brilliant way to throw an enemy off its balance. I mean, it's obviously wicked, unbelievably evil beyond all words and everything like that, but it's also in some ways a sort of brilliant strategic observation in that, Hamas know that if they went straight to the Dimona plant or to the headquarters of the IDF, they would not win. So what do? You attack the most peaceable communities in the south of Israel, and you burn people alive in their houses, and you kidnap children and much more. But one of the things I've thought about since that was actually reflection with speaking with a woman who dealt with and was dealing with a lot of survivors, which is that she read this observation of mine, and she said, I think there's a slight tweak to what you say, Douglas, which is, in a way, they did hit us at our center of gravity. They hit us at our moral center of gravity. I thought that was a profound insight that she had, that yes, of course, that the idea of a peaceful farming community in the south of Israel, which looks after itself and the people and the children run around freely night and day, knowing that, you're safe and so on. But to attack that is to attack one of the cores of the nation. To attack young people dancing in the desert is to attack one of the things that is at the core of the nation, the will for life, the desire for life, the desire to live life fully. And so I think that I've taken that observation she had very much on board. I think that's what they did, and Hamas, in addition, know that they can put the Jewish state in an impossible position. A position I describe in chess is known as Zugzwang. You have to move, but every move will make your position worse. And, you kidnap hundreds of Israeli hostages and you hold them underground in Gaza. Like, what are you meant to do in response to that? Knowing that much of the world will condemn you, whatever you do. And the desire of Hamas is to put Israel in this unwinnable position, which unfortunately so many morons and wicked people and others in the West just very happy to join in on.
Yeah.
Or they'll say, as you well know, they'll say, and some of the people who've interviewed both of us fell into this very fast, which is they'll say, oh, I completely agree that Israel has the right to get the hostages back, but I don't think it's going about it the right way because I, brilliant interviewer A, an expert in hostage extraction from jihadist groups. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's very, very true. You make a really good point in the book about the hostages and the fact that it's well known that Israel does not leave people behind. Yes. And that's another part of, as you describe it, that kind of moral underbelly that Hamas wishes to strike. And there are many nations who would not leave their citizens behind, but Israel in particular refuses ever to leave someone where they are. So Hamas knows that that's a weak point that it can exploit. I want to ask you how you conceive of Hamas. I mean, you write about it at length in the book. People will have read it, but one of the things you've got in trouble for saying over the past 18, 20 months, you've got in trouble for saying many things, but one thing in particular was when you said, I'm paraphrasing now, but something like, the Nazis, when they carried out their mass murder of Jews, they often felt shame. They often felt that this was possibly a wicked thing to do. Some of them would drink, etc., etc. Whereas Hamas gloated and took pride in its fascistic slaughter of Jewish people, posted it online, wanted people to see it, didn't try to hide it. You got a lot of flack for that, even though I understood what you were saying, and I'm sure many other people did as well. But where do you locate Hamas in that history, in that kind of, I guess, the history of fascism or the history of just neo-Nazi scumbags? How do you, how would you describe them, and how would you describe their fundamental mission?
As you know, Brendan, one of the great problems of the age that we're in, which has many good things about it, but many problems as well. One of the problems of the age we're in is that if you write or speak publicly, the idea that you should use your words carefully and that people will fairly interpret them is a thing of the past. You can use your words carefully and they will be deliberately and malevolently misrepresented by people who wish to misrepresent you. So the only reason I make that observation, it's not like one has to grade vicious anti-Semites and racists by category. But it was something which, from the moment that I started seeing the footage coming out of Israel on the 7th, could not get out of my head, which was why the joy and the glee in the voices of the attackers, in the voices of the terrorists. Why that haunting phone call I quote in the opening of the book of the young man from Gaza who phones his family back home and says, on the phone, Father, I've killed 10 Jews with my own hand. Your son has killed Jews. get mother on the phone, and get my brother, and turn on WhatsApp video so I can show you the dead Jews' bodies. That was simply something that I thought about a lot, and it led me to reflect on, yes, something that my late friend George Weidenfeld, who fled the Nazis in 1938, had said to me before the end of his life, which was, I think there might be worse anti-Semites even than the Nazis, which is an extraordinary thing to think. And again, it's not a gradation thing. It's not a competition. But I think that the element of joy and orgiastic boasting of the massacre is something which, again, needs to be contended with. It would be like if the Nazis had live streamed from Treblinka and wanted the world to know.
Yeah.
Again, there's no moral competition in this, but it's simply another, it's that thing of hell being bottomless.
Yeah.
And yes, it's definitely part of a long history in fascistic and death cult movements. I mean, one that I don't mention in the book, but has been much on my mind, is the story you'll know of the great Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno, who wrote The Tragic Sense of Life, who, as Francoist fascism was on the rise in Spain, is trying at the university to which he's given his life, he's trying to reason against the Francoist death cult. And the students pick up the chant in opposition to Unamuno, Viva la muerte, long live death. And Unamuno sees the failure of his own mission, that here are the students engaged in this necrophilic chant, and that all reason is lost in this moment. Again, I think that's there's a tradition of this, and I don't even think it's a political tradition or a religious. I mean, obviously, this manifestation has a very, very profound religious element, but I think it's a human evil tradition, which can jump around like all opportunistic viruses and come at you from another direction.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's, the German novelist Herta Müller, after 7th of October, she made the point that, this is something worse than mass murder, something worse than terrorism. It's a complete break with civilization itself. And when I read that, and when I read you talking about the Nazis and Hamas, and as you say, it's not a gradation, it's not a competition, but there is an observation to be had that something exceptionally anti-civilizational happened on 7th of October, 2023, just as it did during the Nazi era, of course. Speaking of students making necrophilic chants, as you described there in the Franco era, let's talk a bit about the response to 7th of October. And you described this in great detail in the book. You've written and spoken about it in depth over the past 20 months. I knew the response to 7th of October was going to be bad. And in fact, on 7th of October itself, when the known death toll was 20, I wrote a piece for Spiked describing it as a pogrom and saying that people in the West are going to make excuses for this. I had no idea that the death toll was going to rise so high. I didn't know how bad things would get, but I knew there would be a wicked response, and I'm sure you did as well. But have you been surprised at how bad it's been on our campuses, on our streets, kids in green bandanas, people celebrating Jew murder? I mean, how much worse can it get? And were you shocked by how bad it's been so?
They have adopted the lexicon and the dress even of the Islamic extremists.
Yeah.
And it would be as if in the wake of 9/11, there'd been a huge movement of people deciding to grow beards to look like Osama bin Laden. It's such a deranged thing.
Yeah.
to do, but it only makes sense when you realize this is totally imported. It's wholesale politics. It's buffet politics. You just take everything that's there. You take a bit of green, you take another bit of green, Hamas, you take a smattering of this, a bit of that belief. And before you know it, you're dressed in a keffiyeh and pretending to be a Palestinian jihadist.
Yeah.
In the middle of like Columbia University or Yale or something. It's completely deranged, but it's imported. And as I say, it bears repeating this thing that it plays on as an opportunistic infection. It plays on the things these students have already been taught. And one of them, by the way, as I mentioned in the book, I quote a student from Columbia who said this. I was fascinated by this. A student who said, I'm a first generation from a low-income household, first generation of my family to go to university. I came to Columbia, and when I got here, I was taught the rich history of protest at Columbia University, he says. And I remember thinking, when it all kicks off again, I want to be at the center of it. What is it? It could have been climate crisis. That's what people were gearing up to have a year of protest for until Jews were massacred in Israel on the 7th. But then the 7th happens and these people have like, this is the thing. And then you have this extraordinarily deranged thing where they not only, 30 or so student organizations at Harvard on the 7th of October started composing a letter saying that they blamed the Israeli government for everything and that Israel was responsible and so on. And they were doing that on the 7th, again, as the massacre was ongoing. That was their first thought. But consider first, I don't know how long ago you were a student, Brendan, but when I was a student, I did not think that I could dictate foreign policy in far-off countries. It did not occur to me that I should write a letter publicly and announce what my position was on an issue of war. And I didn't, if I had done, I think I would be sectioned back in those days, if I thought that anyone was meant to listen. And then if I claimed that my own university was in some way directing the war, and that's one of the amazing misapprehensions you hear from the students across Western universities, is they seem to think that, like, the Israeli war cabinet is waiting to hear from the faculty at Harvard as to how they should operate in order to return the hostages and destroy Hamas. There's a set of just bewildering misapprehensions that ought normally to lead a caring adult to say, let me just take you aside for a moment and explain your problem. But as so often, as I've said many times in recent years in relation to different issues, the adults have left the room.
Yeah.
There are almost no adults, and the ones that are left behind do things like they cozy up to the students. You saw the other day, Columbia graduation finally goes ahead. Didn't happen last year. Why didn't it happen last year? Because 7th of October. Right. Okay. So Columbia University in New York just can't have a graduation ceremony a year after the massacre of Jews because it'll be disrupted by people who like the massacre of Jews. Okay. Nothing deranged there. And they had it this year, and they have all the protesters, and you have the keffiyeh wearers, and you have all the cosplay people. And of course you have to disrupt the protest. But, the head of the university gives a speech where she says, tries to flatter them, tries to bargain with them, and says, among other things, how much the community is missing this reprehensible young man who was a graduate of the university. It was not actually a student, but had been helping to arrange much of the student protests. She gives a speech where she says, how much we're missing this man. Why are you missing somebody who's not even a student, you dolts? You don't think there's something weird about somebody at the age of 30 living with his pregnant wife with student accommodation? Like, what? And what's he doing there? And what he's doing is he's organizing anti-Semitic protests and calling with his group for the destruction of Western civilization. That's what you're getting. But the head of the university at Columbia the other day says, we're so missing him Yeah, I'm always missing people calling for my destruction. This is a big sentimental problem I have. But she, instead of in any way educating the students, she, like so many of the other adults, decides to flatter them and play to their narcissistic misapprehensions. And yeah, that's why we are where we are. No, not enough adults by far.
No, I think that that point you make about these kids, these Ivy League brats and others, essentially cosplaying as Palestinian militants.
Yes.
In the aftermath of an event in which Palestinian militants raped and murdered 1,200 Jewish people, is extraordinary. And the more I think about, however long passes, it never ceases to disgust and shock me, because this is you have a situation now where the educated youths of the West, many of whom claim to be progressive, they're trans friendly, they're often gender fluid, they claim to be the most open-minded people on earth, although they're very often the opposite. And yet they're adopting the dress and the slogans and the language of a group of Islamist nihilists who would throw them off the top of a building given half the chance. I mean, look at someone like Queers for Palestine, for example. I mean, how suicidal do you think these alliances are that have arisen over the past 20 months?
All the wrong people meet at the point of hell, don't they? I mean, Judith Butler, famous, appalling gender theorist, one of the people who originated that madness, who, by the way, very amusing, she used to be a lesbian and now she's non-binary. It's like, well, if you had such foresight in the ways of gender, oughtn't you to have known in the 1980s that you were non-binary before anyone had a term for this? Anyway, these people like Judith Butler was asked some years ago, I think during the 2006 war, what attitude should we take on the progressive radical left towards groups like Hamas and Hezbollah? And she says, it's very important we stick with them.
Yeah,
it's very important that we realize these are progressive movements as well. What are people like that actually doing? I think it's just, let's take it at its face. They will be on the side of anyone as long as that anyone is anti-Western. They will just be on the side of anyone. That can be Islamic Jihad, it can be Hezbollah, it can be Hamas, it can be Al-Qaeda, it could be any variety of anti-natalism. These will be the same people who'll celebrate abortion rights as like the best thing ever, not just talking about abortion as a sad, sometimes, necessity and so on, but as something that's just glorious and to boast about. They will be on the side of everything that is anti-Western, essentially. And this is just rife. I mean, I just wrote my column for The Spectator and mentioned Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, UK, who, in an interview with The Times 5 years ago, is asked what he'd like his place in history to be. And he says, I think that everything would be a lot better if people if privileged white men like me, do not try to seek a place in history. And you're like, okay, this is just all part of the Danegeld paying of the time, is anything that's against Western man in particular is just, you'll get on board.
Yeah.
And it's wild how far and how wide and how big the tent can be. But you can only understand it if you understand that that's the central aim. It is just anti-West. It is anyone but ourselves.
Yeah.
And, these groups, I mean, I hope they'll never get what they claim to dream for. But, if they did, they'd have, the usual shock, the same shock that has happened throughout history in revolutionary movements when they embrace the fanatics and the fanatics turn out to really mean it,
Yeah. Well, the same shock that leftists in Iran got when they foolishly aligned with the Iranian Revolution in 79. Absolutely. A big shock for those people.
Yeah, you literally help the situation that leads to the Ayatollah maintaining power. And then he imprisons the trade unionists and the leftists, and they get massacred by the thousands in Iranian prisons. And Yeah, that's what had happened. That would be the future for these people. But as I say, I mean, you just hope they never see the day that they're willing on.
I really agree. Anti-Westernism is at the root of all of this. It's such a dangerous death cult of self-loathing that has taken grip in so many sections of the Western world. But I wanted to ask you about the role of anti-Semitism. And there's obviously an interplay between these things, but I think you're like me. You're one of those people who over the past few years has been quite wary about everything being called racism,
Yes.
because everything is called racism now. If you scuff a page in the Quran, as a school kid did recently, that's racism, that's Islamophobia. I remember when a columnist used the word, said that she had a niggardly feeling about Meghan Markle. That was seen as using the N word, which it obviously wasn't. And that was, everything is seen as racist.
Yeah.
So I'm wary of ever doing that. But it does seem to me that a lot of what we've seen over the past 20 months from so-called anti-racist, so-called anti-fascists, has had the pungent whiff of anti-Semitism to it. And a lot of the criticism of Israel does seem to me to cross the line from criticism of a state, which is an absolutely fine thing to do, to a kind of animus towards this particular people against whom there has been animus for many centuries, of course. So what role do you think anti-Semitism plays in informing this moment that you describe?
Yeah, your preamble to that question is a very important issue, because I think that having been through a period where everything was called racist, there's a trap, it seems to me, which is that in an era where you can only explain much of the actions that we've discussed earlier, so far, you can only explain it if you take into account the fact that much of the hatred expressed against the Jewish state in the last 20 months has been completely in line with a long, long history of anti-Semitism. As you say, using the Jews as a scapegoat, projecting onto the Jews one's own sins or perceived sins. All of this is very, very well documented.
Yeah.
And as I say, the fact that Israel is there, the Jewish people are there as like an off-the-shelf explain all thing for a variety of bigots and fools and frauds.
Yeah, so following on from that, I did want to ask you, I think it would be remiss of me not to ask you about the problem of anti-Semitism on sections of the right, or, the problem of Israelophobia on sections of the right, that kind of hostility towards Israel that we're seeing. You famously had a clash on Joe Rogan with Dave Smith, who I was not previously familiar with, I have to say. I don't think those two are anti-Semitic at all. I'm a big fan of Rogan. I think he's a great, curious guy who has a wonderful platform. But it was interesting that you found yourself having to push quite hard against a hostility to Israel coming from that section of the kind of commentator sphere. And we do see a lot of it online. Online, it gets very ugly. What do you think of what's happening on the right in terms of that hostility to Israel that exists, and also just the general sensibleness of debate on the right, which seems to be waning at the moment?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's definitely waning. It goes back slightly to something I mentioned earlier, which is, I find it very interesting. I think neither you nor I suffer from this, but most people have an affliction in politics, which is that a lot of people have an affliction in politics, which is they just take everything at the buffet of their side. It happens particularly when people change political sides, admittedly or otherwise. They just take everything. And I think that there is a element of that is completely understandable, and an element of it, of course, which is something for which one feels a certain amount of disdain. But I think that a part of the political right has certainly fallen into an anti-Semitic place, and an anti-Israel place for sure. And I think they should reflect on, among other things, the fact that what has pushed them there. And there are quite a lot of things that have pushed them there. One is that it is, as I said earlier, it is, to rephrase something, it's a groove into which you can fall with alarming ease.
Yeah.
It's it's just there. There's a reason why anti-Semitism is such a long and powerful force across all sorts of different religious, ethnic, political things. It's a groove you can fall into with great ease because it's just there as an omni explanation. You know, everything from why are these things happening globally to why is my life not working out? It's just there for everything. And the reason why it's being pushed at the moment on the American right in particular is a very, very interesting thing. Some of it is simply organized by Qatar, the Iranian revolutionary government, principally by Qatar through funding of universities, institutions, media, and much more. The Qataris are responsible for a lot of pushing around. Again, as often happens, they are actually guilty of the thing that people accuse Israel of. It's like unbelievable compromising funding of the country's enemies and, you know, enemy narratives. So some of it is absolutely pushed. Others, it's there as an explanation. I mean, I've been very interested by watching this, and it's difficult to watch because it's hard to see where it becomes serious and actually breaks the surface. I'm like, why should a couple of comedians be having any kind of sway? I was interested watching Piers Morgan a couple of days ago, talking to the international lawyer and friend of mine, Natasha Hausdorff, and being exceptionally rude and dismissive and disparaging and really unprofessional with her. Really unprofessional, just shouting that she was talking bullshit and not allowing her to finish an answer, and just such ugly, ugly hatred that he was expressing towards what was just a different opinion from the one that he's found himself holding. And he turns to comic Dave Smith and he says, you know, these Israelis, so they're treating us like that we're just clowns, you know, sort of thing. Again, your other guest is literally a clown. That's his job. His job is to be a clown. The fact that I don't think he's ever said anything funny to my knowledge but it's like there in the name. Your job is to be a clown. You look a little bit at these people and you think, what do I have to pay attention to this? Where does it become serious enough that you have to pay attention? And I think it becomes serious enough that you have to pay attention when this falls into a groove which is just highly recognizable. And if it falls into that groove and it actually has some impact, and it's quite hard in our current media and the social media landscape to work out what is impactful. So that, as I say, there's been a sort of flattening process whereby an international lawyer like Natasha Hausdorff, 20 years experience at the bar, is to be invited on as a guest with a comedian and not just as equals, but actually as her then worse off. Her knowledge and expertise makes her less desirable to listen to than a comedian just riffing on stuff he's read online. And so there's this very weird media and social media landscape we're in. What I can see now is that the elements of the right that are playing with this stuff are doing several things. One is there's definitely an American isolationist thing, which is a recognizable strand, the Buchananite right. It's a long part of American politics of the isolationism of we just don't care about the world. As I've often said, it's a paradoxical position because the people who want America, these people want America to remain the world's superpower and the world's dominant power, but they don't want to be involved in the world. Okay, right, that's their problem to work out. But that isolationist tendency is there. Then you add in various other things, and they include, for instance, now a belief that somehow America would not be in trouble in the Middle East or any other region if it weren't for Israel. That America is somehow being tainted by association with Israel. And if we only cozied up to our real friends, you know, Qatar, the Ayatollah, that would all be better. And therefore Israel becomes like the cause of your problems.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of other things going on as well. One thing that I became very aware of when I was writing my book, The Strange Death of Europe, and trying to get an early sense of European movements of the right, was that there are also attempts to radically rewrite history because of the awkwardness of certain things that happened in history. If you are holding a view about what has gone wrong, I became very alert to right-wing movements on the continent of Europe, for instance, who, when you think like, why do you play around with things like this is on the fringes, but nevertheless, sometimes you sort of need to get a whiff of what is happening on the fringes to see what might come in. There was always a problem on the European right that there were portions of it that would blame Israel and the Jews in particular for mucking up the whole cause of their ethno-nationalist project.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that if the Jews hadn't been massacred in the Holocaust, we could have got on with our ethno-nationalist projects or our right-wing projects or whatever. And the Holocaust and the Jews and the creation state of Israel causes a problem for these people. And you can definitely hear that on parts of the American right now, which is because of the 1940s, our desires and our projects got upset. Yeah. And therefore, what can we do? One is to try to deny that or try to get around it. Another is to play all sorts of games of the Canaanite tendency, which is, if we hadn't have got involved, then we wouldn't be in the problems that we're currently in. If we'd have allowed the Nazis and the communists to fight it out, we wouldn't have, American cities covered with fentanyl-laced drugs and, homelessness and all of these problems. It's a not very well thought out, but existing strain in American conservative right-wing political thought at the moment. Yeah. And I think it's very, very low grade. And besides anything else, is sort of always a futile thing because conservatives in particular always have a tendency to sort of say, where is the moment that the thing went wrong? And that's very interesting as an intellectual exercise. And it's pretty hopeless as a political exercise because there's nothing you can do about it now. Yeah. If only in the War of Independence in America, we hadn't done why. Well, yeah, but we're here because history happened. And it's useful and interesting to work out where the things have gone wrong. And it's simultaneously slightly hopeless. But yeah, I'm still really, I'm watching this movement on the American right and it's still somewhat unclear exactly what is going on. But then that's because the movement itself is unclear and is trying to work out its own thoughts on the fly. But I think that one other thing I would say is I think a lot of the people who are in a very specific anti-Israel place are there because wittingly or otherwise they've been pushed there by the pressures of the time. Nobody is going to berate a television host or a podcast host for not having said enough about Sudan.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no campus will be protested and no graduation ceremony in America will be protested because of a lack of focus in that semester by the university administration on the killing going on in Sudan.
Yeah.
But there are these people from the university heads to the sort of Piers Morgans who will feel like they have to have a stance on like phase 2 of the conflict in Gaza. And they get pushed into it.
Yeah.
Wittingly or otherwise. I think largely unwittingly. Why haven't you spoken about this? Why haven't you condemned Y? Oh, so you're a supporter of Z.
Yeah. As you say, it's very low grade. I find it incredibly worrying. It's hard to work out how influential these strains will become, but there does seem to be a pincer movement of scapegoating at the moment. So the left scapegoats Israel and has been doing for some time, and now sections of the right are doing a similar thing.
Yes.
And the Churchill bashing, this kind of revisionism of history where Churchill was the bad guy and maybe Hitler was misunderstood. I mean, I know that remains a relatively fringe idea, but it's out there, and it is incredibly worrying.
And it's not fringe once the world's biggest podcaster has people who believe that on his platform, and they talk unchallenged.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you can see there's a guy called Ian Carroll who has been a guest on Joe Rogan. You can see interviews that he does with other people afterwards, in which he boasts about how he's slowly bringing in the Jewish question to Joe Rogan's audience. And that's what he calls it, the Jewish question, and he's bringing it softly, and he boasts about this. James Lindsay has reposted the videos on his Twitter, that this guy is like, you can't go straight in, on all of the heaviest anti-Jewish stuff, but you can introduce them to it. You can just ask questions and so on. And he's being congratulated by this anti-Semite for the brilliance of his maneuver in introducing Joe Rogan's audience to anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And, I think, like me, Brendan, your view is, if I don't agree with it, I don't agree with it whether my own side is doing it or not. Yeah. And I don't agree with it whether people I like are doing it or not. Yeah. And I don't agree with it whether people with huge platforms that I could do with are doing it or not.
Yeah.
But it's very, very disappointing. I have to put it at its mildest. It is very disappointing that this is going on.
If something's morally wrong, it's morally wrong. And it doesn't matter whether you like the person pursuing it or you don't. Douglas, just two more quick questions for you. I want to ask you about a different form of anti-Semitism. So we've looked at the left-leaning version, the right-leaning version, but there's also the problem of Muslim anti-Semitism, which is the one form of racism you're not allowed to talk about, actually. You will be damned. I think it was Rod Liddle who said, we're now reaching a situation where it's Islamophobic to talk about anti-Semitism, because if you do, you'll be accused of bullying Muslims in Europe. How much of it, I mean, you've written about this at length. You've written about the strange death of Europe. You've written about some of these intersecting crises of our time. When I've gone on some of the anti-Israel demos over the past 20 months, strictly to observe them, not to take part, I have noticed a kind of unholy marriage between kind of bourgeois people from the leafy suburbs and young radical Muslims, radical Islamists, people who wear the keffiyeh and say, we want jihad, etc. How much of a problem do you think that anti-Semitism is becoming, and why are people so reluctant to grapple with it?
It really is, as you say, it is Islamophobic to mention Muslim anti-Semitism. And at some level, I think governments, police forces and others just decide this is a numbers game. There are more Muslims than there are Jews in the world and in countries like Britain, and therefore it's just easier. Give the Muslims their Islamophobia, rights, and it'll all go away as a problem. I think this is profoundly misguided.
Yeah.
Islam has an anti-Semitism problem from the roots of the religion, and it's undealt with. It's just not been dealt with. And, Christianity has had a long history of anti-Semitism. But if a Christian pastor or bishop or priest, anyone stood up in a pulpit and said, we must kill all the Jews, it would be front page news, and all the leadership of the church would denounce the person in question, and Absolutely. They would have no future in the church. By contrast, not just in the Middle East, in England today, we have the videos that mosques across the country have post on their own websites. It's not like they're hiding it. We'll do sermons calling for the end times and the destruction of the Jews. And if if people don't think that's a problem for everyone, I don't know. I mean, obviously, as I say, a country like Britain is in a stage of denial because we have massive immigration. We've imported a lot of Islamic extremism. We've imported a lot of people who hate Jews and hate Britain. And I think that there is a general feeling like, let's allow them to continue hating the Jews, and we'll worry about the rest when we come to it. It's just all so misguided.
Yeah.
The theological fundaments of Islam have a deep anti-Semitism problem, and that's because the Jews were among the first people to reject the so-called revelation of Muhammad. They just said, no, we've got our traditions, we've got our book, we don't need yours. And the fact that Muhammad himself, the inventor of Islam, killed Jews with his own hands, is a problem. I mean, that's a big problem. Mm-hmm. And if you're a Muslim, and what do you do about that? A lot of people say that that's just not the case. They pretend that their own text, or a lot of people don't know, maybe. Certainly a lot of non-Muslims don't know that. But a lot of Muslims either deny that, or will just try to shut it down, get around that difficult corner by saying Islamophobia.
Yeah.
I would urge them to do a different thing, which is to deal with it and to get over it, to get past it. And it would be very good for the Muslim world as well, because if they decided to work with the Jewish state, for instance, in the Middle East, then you'd have a lot more success in the Middle East, and you'd have a lot less economic deprivation and much more, because all of the creativity and advances of the Jewish state could be shared with more with their neighbors. But it's a big problem for everyone else in the West, because, as I say, I mean, like, what do we think is going to happen? Really, what do we think is going to happen if the Muslim world doesn't address problems like that, and if the Muslim faith and Muslim faith leaders don't address problems like that? And they just don't. They deny it, and they prevaricate, and they push it away, and they throw Islamophobia out. But as I've said many times, you can see the consequences of Muslim anti-Semitism all over the world. You can see it in our own cities. And to get an idea of its toxicity, you've got to imagine that if the history of Christianity would be better or worse if, instead of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had called for the eradication of the Jews. Mm-hmm. To understand the problem of Muslim anti-Semitism, you would have to, the only way you could play it out would be, imagine if Jesus Christ had, by his own hand, massacred a Jewish tribe. And would the history of Christianity have been more anti-Semitic or less anti-Semitic if that's been at the foundations? And the answer, of course, is more.
Yeah.
And that's just a problem that is so big and so deep, and most people don't want to go anywhere near it.
Yeah. That's a very striking way to put it. And as with all these things, it's the reluctance to be honest about it and to allow free discussion about it that makes the problems worse and worse. Okay, Douglas, my last question for you, which is not necessarily one that you will want to answer, I don't know, but you're a chronicler of our times, and a very good one. You're not a politician, but if you were to suggest some ways that we might deal with these problems, or things that we could do, or things that we might change that could shift things a bit and shift the stuff we've seen over the past 20 months have exposed some of the moral rot in Western society to an extraordinary degree, more than anything else in my lifetime. What do you think we can do or start to do to try and turn some of this stuff around?
First thing would be to be honest with ourselves, to admit to the problems, to admit that there's something that's gone badly, badly wrong. And then to ask why, and then start to turn it around. I think in general, most of the problems that I've written about and you've written about come back to a central question, which is, whether the liberal democratic states that we live in can cope with can develop the ability to say no or not. And if the states we live in are not capable of saying no, that's something we don't put up with, then we're in real trouble for all of the foreseeable future. But that's what it comes down to, is like, are we able, are institutions able, and are our countries able to say, that's something we do not allow. And if you want to do that, like if you want to bring down the West, if you want to kill the Jews, if you hate liberal democracy and you want to end it and subvert it, there are lots of places you can live, but this ain't one of them. And, you know, it's like the pussyfooting for all my adult life around this question has been extraordinary. But there is an answer to that, which is, yes, you say, I'm sorry, very sorry, chaps, but there are limits and there are rules. There are rules, like joining any club, that there are rules in this country. And these are the things we don't put up with. And like, you know, if you're a vicious anti-Semite, vicious anti-Westerner, hate the infidels and so on, then hop it. We haven't got space for you here, and we don't want you here. And that would do a huge amount, because as we've all seen in different countries, a country can lean, as I would say, it doesn't even have to be particularly forceful actions. It can lean in a certain direction, and people follow that. On a range of issues, you know, if government leans into something, then it takes off or it stops. And that's what I'd like to see, is just a drawing of the line. And it's alarming to me that in British politics in particular, that line is talked about but never enforced. You know, and I mean, it's talked about. I mean, you know, Keir Starmer yesterday, the day before speaking, was tweeting about how angry he is about the illegal boats coming at the southern border of the UK. But he just tweets he's angry about it. Well, anyone can do that. Anyone with an X account can do that. But you're the Prime Minister. Don't you have any power to stop it? To act? That's and the fact that even opposition parties of the right don't really want to get into the details of how they would turn any of this around. And but it doesn't mean there isn't time. Doesn't mean it can't be done. I'd like to see it done. And in that whole thing, I do think that the questions of the Jews and anti-Semitism are one of the early warning sirens of a deep lack of health in society, and indeed in a person. And that's why it's so important. That's why it matters. That's why, to say, why are you focused on this? It's because as a writer, you should be alert to the early warning sirens, the early warning problems, and do what you can to raise your voice and to warn, and in the hope that people will listen, because there's not much pleasure in being proved right after everything's gone wrong.
Douglas, thank you very much.
Thank you.